Well, hello and good morning, friends and faithful listeners. And thank you so much for tuning into the Bible Explained podcast on this absolutely lovely, lovely morning. We're going to be talking about 3 chapters of the Bible today, 1 Chronicles 24 through 26. And we will be talking more about the Levites. And at this point, you might be like, Jen, how much more can we talk about the Levites? Oh, we can talk about them more. We're going to get into the ins and outs of the Levitical clan, but this time we're going to be going a lot more in depth as to who the Levites were and why they were so important, both in the days of the scriptures, but also nowadays as well. Stay tuned for that discussion. So where I live, I'm starting to see the fall colors coming in on the trees, just on the little, the tips of the trees. I'm starting to see the orange and the red coming through. And I'm beginning to embrace it. I can't hang on to summer forever as much as I'd like to. I'm embracing the fall weather. So I have my nice little light sweater on today, and I'm enjoying the view from my window here. So yes, unfortunately, winter is coming. Fall used to be my favorite holiday back before I was an adult. Because all kids love the snow. But then once you're actually in the snow as an adult, it's no fun. It's just an unenjoyable experience for the most part. So not looking forward to winter, but beginning to embrace fall a little bit. But let me know, do you enjoy fall or do you hate it? Do you like winter or do you hate it? I'd also like to know where you live and whether you have really bad winters or really bad snowstorms. I'd like to hear about all of that. You're going to find my contact information listed in the description of this episode. So answer that question. What is your favorite season? But today, let's go ahead and read 1 Chronicles 24 through 26. So I'd like to start in 1 Chronicles 24, verses 1 through 6. But before I delve into what scripture is getting at here, don't forget that there are 3 divisions of the Levites. So the Levites were the only tribe out of all of the 12 tribes of Israel that were allowed to be priests and also allowed to serve in leadership positions in the temple. No other tribe could do what the Levites did. Now, not every single Levite was a priest, but every priest at this point in time had to be a Levite. That was all dictated by God back in the wilderness when he was giving his instructions to the Israelite people. So the Levites were very, very important because they basically oversaw the worship of Yahweh. They needed to have a good grasp of the law. They needed to understand it themselves so that they could help the people understand who God was and what his laws actually were. So the Levites were very, very important. And that means that they were a tribe set apart. They were very different from the other tribes of Israel. The other tribes got pieces of land. When they went into the promised land, the Levites were the only ones that did not get a big chunk of land like the other tribes did. Instead, the Levites were supposed to go and live among all of the other tribes of Israel. Now, obviously, they were allowed to own land. Like it wasn't like they couldn't have their own home or something. They were allowed to own land and farms and whatever else, but they did not get their own chunk of land, if that makes sense. When you look at the ancient maps of Israel, you're not going to see a tribe of Levi on there. You're going to see the tribe of Judah, you're going to see the tribe of Naphtali and whatever other tribe, but you're not going to see the tribe of Levi because they were supposed to go and spread God's law and be a blessing to every single tribe and live among every single tribe. Kind of like, I guess, modern day evangelists. And so the Levites were a tribe that was certainly set apart, certainly supposed to be different. And another thing that made them unique as compared to the other tribes was that they had 3 divisions within the tribe of Levi, almost like 3 mini tribes. And each division had a different role that they were supposed to do. So the 3 divisions of the Levites were the Kohathites, the Gershonites, and the Merarites. The Kohathite Levites were the only ones that were allowed to be priests. If you were a Gershonite Levite, you could not be a priest. If you were a Merarite Levite, you also could not be a priest. You had to be a Kohathite Levite from the family of Aaron. And the Kohathites that weren't able to be priests, they had the responsibility of taking care of the temple furniture. The Gershonite Levites could not be priests, but they did have the role of taking care of the temple coverings. So any kind of tapestries or ropes or tassels, I guess, anything that made the temple look pretty. That was what the Gershonites were in charge of. And then the Merarite Levites had the responsibility of taking care of the structure of the temple. So anything that was problematic with the structure, the Merarite Levites would go in there and they would fix it, make sure that it was stable and up to code. They would take care of everything regarding the structure of the temple itself. So that was the three divisions of the Levites. And so when David, who is the first person to actually organize the Levites for worship, after the Israelites have been in the promised land for hundreds of years, David's the only one that thinks it's necessary to do this, he actually breaks up the Levites even further into more specific jobs. And that is what 1 Chronicles 24 through 26 goes through. Starting in 1 Chronicles 24, 1 through 6, here's what it says. These were the divisions of the sons of Aaron. So that would mean the Kohathite Levites that were allowed to be priests. The sons of Aaron were Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. But Nadab and Abihu died before their father and had no children. Therefore, Eleazar and Ithamar served as priests. So that is the story of Aaron's two sons, Nadab and Abihu. That's talked about in Leviticus chapter 10, where Nadab and Abihu, who are the new priests of the Israelites, they decide to go into the temple and offer a strange fire before Yahweh. And so Yahweh's fire actually comes down and completely consumes them so that they died. But God's fire did not consume their clothes. Like God left the priestly garments to be picked up by another person. And so reading that story in Leviticus chapter 10, you might be like, why in the world did God go so far as to kill these two men because they offered a strange fire? Like, what does that even mean? How is fire strange? Like, how is one fire different from another fire? Well, it was different because if you look in Leviticus chapter 9, God himself lights the fire on the altar that was supposed to burn continually. And the priests were supposed to go and get their fire to burn incense or anything else that needed burning from the fire that God had lit on that altar. They were not supposed to light their own fires at all. They were always supposed to go to the altar to get fire from God. And they were supposed to make sure that that fire continued all the time. But for whatever reason, maybe out of laziness or just complete rebellion, Nadab and Abihu decide to light their own fire and bring that in to offer to God. And God, who was present inside the temple, did not accept that strange fire. But that begs the question, what was so different about Nadab and Abihu's fire as compared to the fire that God lit? Well, whenever we see God lighting fire, it is something miraculous and amazing. For example, the burning bush, that's a very famous story where Moses encountered God out in the wilderness by seeing this burning bush. But the leaves on this bush were still intact. The fire was not hot at all. And this was a very special fire from God himself. So whenever we see fire coming down from heaven, that is a special type of fire. And God wanted that specific fire to always be burning inside the temple. And Nadab and Abihu was just like, oh, God's fire is no more special than the fire that we light. And they were proved wrong because that fire ended up consuming them when they tried to offer it to God. So Nadab and Abihu, who were two of the first priests of Israel, ended up dying almost immediately because of their disobedience and rebellion toward God. So Aaron's other two sons served as priests instead of Nadab and Abihu. Aaron's other sons were named Eleazar and Ithamar, is what it says in verse 2. And all of the priests from that time forward came from either Eleazar or Ithamar. Then continuing in our passage for today, in verse 3, it says, David with Zadok of the sons of Eleazar and Ahimelech, the sons of Ithamar, divided them according to their ordering in their service. There were more chief men found of the sons of Eleazar than of the sons of Ithamar, and they were divided like this. Of the sons of Eleazar, there were 16, heads of the fathers' houses, and the sons of Ithamar, according to their fathers' houses, 8. Now we know that children are a blessing from God. That is what Scripture says. And it's really interesting here that Eleazar had more sons than Ithamar did. which I think kind of shows that God's blessing was more on the house of Eleazar than on Ithamar. That actually makes some sense to me because of Aaron's two sons, Eleazar was the far more obedient one to God. There's a very famous story actually of Eleazar actually going in and killing somebody who was having pagan sexual relations with a woman outside of God's temple. Eleazar went in and actually killed this man and woman while they were in the middle of doing it because they were bringing dishonor and pagan rituals into God's camp. And God blessed Eleazar, I believe, because of that, because Eleazar was not afraid to stand up for God and say, no, this is wrong, and I am not going to allow this to come inside of God's temple. Eleazar kind of did what he was supposed to as the priest, and it turns out that he ended up having more children than his brother Ithamar did. Now, that being said, of course, Ithamar was still blessed. He still had many sons himself, but Eleazar had more, and I do believe that that shows God's blessing on the house of Eleazar. In verse 5, it says, they were divided impartially by drawing lots. For there were princes of the sanctuary and princes of God, both of the sons of Eleazar and of the sons of Ithamar. So there you go. I mean, God blessed both Eleazar and Ithamar. And when David was deciding who gets what role as priest, he ended up doing this system where he impartially casts lots, meaning that there was no rhyme or reason as to who was going to get what particular role as priest in God's temple. This was a very common thing in Israel, was that they would leave decisions up to God by casting lots. They believed that if they just threw the dice, wherever they landed, that was what God had chosen. And there was some credence to that, actually. God did use the randomized casting of lots on many occasions to talk to his people. So there was some evidence that God, in fact, was choosing each individual man if lots for them was cast. It says in verse 6 that Shemaiah, the son of Nethanel, the scribe, who is of the Levites, wrote them in the presence of the king, the princes, Zadok the priest, Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar, and the heads of the father's household of the priests and the Levites, one father's house being taken for Eleazar and the other for Ithamar. And then in verses 7 through 19, it actually goes into how the lots were cast and who ended up getting what position for the roles of priests. And I'm not going to go into all of that, but I'll read the first few verses so you kind of hear what it sounds like. Starting in verse 7. Now the first lot came out to Jehoiarib, the second to Judea, the third to Harim, the fourth to Seorim, the fifth to Malchijah, the sixth to Majamin, the seventh to Hakis. And I'm not going to keep going because I'm already struggling with the names, but you guys get the gist of what is going on here. So the die was being thrown for each person, or rather the lots were being cast for each person, and they were getting their position based upon the roll of the die, pretty much. And so in verse 19, it says, this was their ordering in their service to come into Yahweh's house according to the ordinance given to them by Aaron their father, as Yahweh, the God of Israel, had commanded him. Then in verses 20 through 31, to finish out this chapter, it talks about the rest of the Kohathite Levites, but the ones that were not of the family of Aaron, meaning the Kohathite Levites that could not become the priests. They also had jobs that they were supposed to do inside of the temple, and lots again were cast for them. It says in verse 31 that these likewise cast lots, even as their brothers, the sons of Aaron, in the presence of David the king, Zadok, Ahimelech, and the heads of the fathers' houses of the priests and of the Levites, the fathers' households of the chief, even as those of his younger brother. So now all of the Kohathite Levites, whether they be priests or not, have now been given their roles by casting lots. And I believe David did this specifically so that there was no partiality, that he wasn't playing any favorites, really trying to leave it up to the hands of God. Moving into 1 Chronicles 25, it now talks about the musicians again. And of course, you guys know I love talking about the musicians because I am a musician myself. And so it's a fun topic for me. So starting in verse 1 of 1 Chronicles 25, it says, moreover, David and the captains of the army set apart for the service certain of the sons of Asaph, of Haman, and of Jeduthun, who were to prophesy with harps, stringed instruments, and with cymbals. Now, for those of you faithful members who are going through the Psalms with me on Fridays, you know the name Asaph. He was credited for writing 12 of the Psalms, and they're beautiful Psalms, and they are certainly very prophetic. It actually says here that Asaph, being a musician, along with these other musicians, Heman and Jeduthun, they were prophets, and they specifically prophesied with harps, with stringed instruments, and with cymbals. And that shows right there that the gift of prophecy is far more broad than we generally think of it being. Usually when we think of a prophet, we think of somebody who is talking about something that hasn't happened yet, giving us like a doomsday scenario, kind of explaining what Revelation means, maybe predicting Jesus' second coming, which is like super popular right now. In fact, I am recording this yesterday. So I'm recording this on Tuesday. Everybody right now is actually saying that Jesus is going to come again today. And man, I really hope so. I hope that I look out my window and I see Jesus coming out of the clouds right now. That would be absolutely fantastic. But I suspect that I'm still going to be here tomorrow and that all of you guys will be as well, because we don't know the day or the hour. We don't know when Jesus is going to come. We usually think of prophets as being somebody who predicts when Jesus is going to come again. And many people on YouTube will say that they are great prophets, that they just have some sort of special revelation from God, or they've been to heaven, or they see visions or something along those lines. Kind of reminds me of what we were talking about yesterday, with the super apostles in Paul's day who would go around claiming that they had some sort of revelation or special knowledge from God, but they were just charlatans. I'm not saying that every single prophet out there that claims to be a prophet is a charlatan. Don't get me wrong on that. I'm saying probably like 98% of them are, though. And you need to be very careful about prophecy. It actually says we're supposed to test the prophets, because having a word from God that seems really special that nobody else knows about, that is a moneymaker. Unfortunately, it gets people a lot of fame. That's why these YouTube prophets have so many followers, so much credence, is because it seems really cool to be the one that talks to God directly or has God talk to them directly. But overwhelmingly, I would say with the majority of these people, God is not actually speaking to them. That being said, I don't want to say every single prophet out there is a false prophet, because prophecy is a gift from God. And God does, in fact, talk to certain people. But you have to be very careful. The first way you can know if a prophet is real or not is if his or her prophecy comes true. If it does not come true, you can guarantee that that person is a false prophet. So if you and I are still here tomorrow after Rosh Hashanah is over and Jesus has not come back, because all of these quote unquote prophets right now are saying that Jesus is going to come back, which is today and yesterday. If he does not come back, you can guarantee that those prophets were false prophets, and you should not listen to anything they have to say in the future regarding prophecy, because they lied from the beginning and showed that they were not real prophets. So what is a real prophet? Well, a real prophet is somebody who has a word from God. That might not be talking about the future at all. That could just be talking about some sort of revelation that you get in scripture, or maybe God just speaking to you on a personal level, or maybe even God telling you, like you have this gut feeling that God is telling you to go talk to somebody and give them a word of encouragement. This actually just happened to one of my best friends recently. She was really struggling with something, and she went to go take a walk around her neighborhood. And she said that a woman followed her. She knew kind of who the woman was. It was one of her neighbors. She had seen the woman before, but never really talked to her. Apparently, this woman followed my friend because she was told by God that she needed to go and say something to my friend. And so my friend Kelsey was like, that's the first time that ever happened to me. And, I barely knew this woman, hardly ever talked to her before. And yet God had given this woman a revelation that she needed to talk to me. And that was impactful for me because of what I was going through, because I was praying to God that I needed just something from him. And he, sent me this woman. to me, I would consider that neighbor of my friend to be a prophetess because she got something from God that told her to go and speak to somebody that she did not know. That right there is who the prophets are. And usually they are living among us. They don't have big platforms. They don't proclaim their prophecies to millions of people. But these prophets and prophetesses, they edify and encourage individual people that they come across, whether it's in their church or their neighbors, like in the case of my friend, or a stranger even at the store. That is who the real prophets are. They are the ones living among us who we barely even know about. In the case of Asaph and Heman and Jeduthun, they were musical prophets, meaning in my mind that they were getting lyrics from God, that God himself was speaking through their music. In fact, if you go into Asaph and Jeduthun and Heman a little bit more in 1 Chronicles 25, here's what it says about Asaph. It says that Asaph prophesied at the order of the king. Of Jeduthun, it says that he prophesied in giving thanks and praising Yahweh with the harp. So you can apparently also prophesy through the giving of thanks, which is kind of interesting. So I think that shows right there that, the gift of prophecy, especially in today's culture, is very misunderstood as to what it actually is. But after going off on that tangent, as I told you guys, I love talking about the musicians here. Verses 1 through 8 talk about the sons of all three of these musical prophets, Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun, and how these men were blessed under God. Now, Asaph, who was probably the most prominent of these three musicians, it actually talks about in the book of Ezra how his family was one of the first to come back after the Babylonian exile. I believe Jeduthun's family also came back as well, but Haman's family was unfortunately lost to history. So we don't know if they all died. We don't know what happened to Haman's family, but we do know that Asaph specifically, his family did come back to the promised land very quickly after the Babylonian exile. In verse 8, it mentions that between these three men and their families, who are also musicians, they cast lots for their offices, all alike, the small as well as the great, the teacher as well as the student. And then in verses 9 through 31 of the end of the chapter, it talks about who got these particular offices. But what's really cool about this is, David was doing his best to show impartiality between all of the musicians. In this case, the teacher was not greater than the student. And I think that this was a way to not only leave it up to God as to who is going to get what position, but also to teach the musicians some humility. Us musicians, we have a hard time not letting our musicality go to our heads. It's a very in the spotlight type of role, especially if you're good at it. You get a lot of compliments, you get a lot of praise, a lot of people saying like, oh, I wish I could do what you do. It's hard not to let that go to your head. And this exercise of casting lots for the prominent positions would certainly be a very humbling thing, especially if you did not get the role that you wanted. But that was by design. And I think that was a very, very good idea for David to do with these musicians. And then moving into 1 Chronicles 26, it now talks about the doorkeepers and also the judges and treasurers of God's house. So in verses 1 through 19, it mentions who the doorkeepers were going to be. And this was also done by casting lots once again. The doorkeepers had a very important role, and it wasn't so much a spiritual role as it was a physical role. The doorkeepers were the security of God's temple. They made sure that nobody got in who was trying to cause trouble, and they also probably had to boot people out who were already in the temple causing trouble. One of the more notable doorkeepers here was named Obed-Edom. You might remember that name because he was the guy that took care of the Ark of the Covenant for a little while. For 3 months after David tried to, for the first time, bring it into the city, there was an incident where God struck someone dead because they mishandled the Ark of the Covenant. So David, who was terrified and angry at God, actually sent the Ark of the Covenant to this guy named Obed-Edom, where God blessed Obed-Edom so drastically because the Ark of the Covenant was being taken care of so well by his family. And actually, it says right here in 1 Chronicles 26, verse 4, that Obed-Edom had all of these family members, all of these sons, because God blessed him. That was in our passage for today. So yes, Obed-Edom was greatly blessed for his role in taking care of the Ark of the Covenant. Moving down to the treasurers, in verse 20, it says, of the Levites, Ahijah was over the treasurers of God's house and over the treasuries of the dedicated things. Once again, lots were cast in order to decide who the treasurers were going to be. And then lastly, in verses 29 through 32, it mentions the judges of Israel. David actually instituted judges to go out into all the different districts, all the different tribes of Israel, and take on smaller cases that David just could not do. The Levites were supposed to do that. Here's what it says in verse 29. Of the Izharites, Chenaniah and his sons were appointed to the outward business over Israel for officers and judges. Of the Hebronites, Hashbiah and his brothers, 1,700 men of valor, had the oversight of Israel beyond the Jordan westward for all the business of Yahweh and for the service of the king. And then it goes into some of the other Levites as well, who had jobs on the other side of the Jordan River inside the promised land, if that makes sense. So yes, all of these divisions were organized very well by David. And this is the first time anybody thought to do this, though this was something very necessary, very important for the structure of Israel, for the worship of Israel. David, a man after God's own heart, knew how important this was, especially since he was about to die and Solomon was going to take over the throne. David wanted to help any way he possibly can to make sure that Israel's heart remained loyal to God. And that is why the Levitical priests were so important. And they're important even today. Though this structure has been done away with since Jesus came and became our sacrifice, the Levites are the only tribe of Israel who still have their records, who still know who they are. All of the other tribes, their records were lost after Rome came in and pretty much trampled Jerusalem in AD 70. The records were lost. And a Jewish person today, unless he or she is a Levite, they do not know what tribe they are from. They generally just say we're from the tribe of Judah. But somehow the Levites were the only ones who were able to maintain their records, which is super cool. And that kind of shows that, in my mind, God is not done with the Levites yet. And I do believe that that's the case because the Levites are going to play, I believe, a very important role for rebuilding the temple in these days. That's prophesied about, that the Jewish people are going to try to rebuild the temple. And when they do, they're going to need the Levites to come back in and do all of the sacrifices and everything else that needs done inside of the temple. And that's all prophecy that is going to happen right before Jesus comes back. So I personally think it's really cool that the Levites still know who they are and that Jewish people are getting ready to rebuild the temple and are getting ready to institute the Levites once again to perform the duties of the temple all over again. Now, of course, I have no clue when the new temple is going to be rebuilt, but I do know that the Jewish people have been talking about it since they've been back in the Promised Land for about a century now. They certainly want to rebuild the temple, and we might see it in our lifetime. I don't know. But anyway, faithful listeners, I hope that you guys enjoyed talking about the Levites a little bit more. One thing that I forgot to mention actually in the podcast is that, the reason the chronicler focused in on the Levites so heavily was because most likely he was a Levite himself. But he knew that after the Babylonian exile was finished, the Levites were the ones who were going to change the course of Israel because Israel was no longer going to have a king. When the Babylonians let the Israelites come back to their land, there was no more king of Israel. And so the Levites would have to take it over. And I think that's why the chronicler was so focused on making sure the Levites knew what they were doing, what family they were from, so they could go back, rebuild the temple, and serve in the position that they were supposed to serve in. Anyway, faithful listeners, I hope you all have a fantastic and wonderful wonderful rest of your day. I will see you guys tomorrow as we discuss 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. And speaking of the second coming, which it seems like it's coming up a lot these days, we are going to certainly start delving more into Jesus' second coming, especially as we move into 1 Thessalonians 3 and 4. Faithful listeners, I'll see you guys tomorrow, 6 a.m. or whenever you choose to wake up and listen. Until then, happy listening and God bless.